In the heart of Yumikoro village, nestled between lush fields and winding streams, stood a large compound that belonged to Kofi, a respected and wealthy farmer known far and wide for his abundant harvests and sharp business sense. To the villagers, he was a man of standing, a patriarch with 2 wives and many children. But inside the walls of his house, behind the carved wooden doors and sun-warmed clay walls, lived a truth far less admirable, a quiet cruelty, a hidden injustice that stained the air like smoke no one dared to speak of. Kofi's first wife, Amma, was a gentle and selfless woman. She bore him only one child, a girl named Amina, delicate in form but fierce in spirit. Amma raised her daughter with quiet devotion, teaching her songs that had been passed down through generations, and the rhythm of the drum that echoed the heartbeats of their ancestors. Yet, despite her love and grace, Amma was treated as a shadow in her own home. When Kofi took a second wife, Abina, everything changed. Abina was beautiful, cunning, and full of ambition. She gave Kofi what he prized most: sons, loud, brash, and many. With each boy she bore, her power in the household grew, and so did her cruelty toward Amma and Amina. She ruled the compound like a queen, her voice sharp as cane, her eyes always watching for a reason to scold or shame. Amma, once the lady of the house, was pushed aside like old furniture, useful only for labor and forgotten when it came time to share joy, laughter, or meals. Amina, despite her tender age, saw everything. She saw the way her mother was served last at meals, how she herself was given tattered clothes while her half-brothers strutted in bright new garments. She noticed how Abina's children laughed at her, calling her names, mocking her drum songs as witches' lullabies. Her only safe place was in her mother's arms, or in the still moments at dawn when the house was quiet, and she could touch the carved drum skin and feel her mother's rhythm pulsing in her fingers like a secret code of survival. Kofi rarely intervened. To him, the measure of a child's worth was in the strength of his back and the weight of his footsteps. Amina, in his eyes, was too soft, too much like her mother. He never saw the fire in her eyes, the quiet determination that bloomed silently each time she was overlooked or ordered about. He praised Abina for her sons, for their noise, for their hunger, for the way they wrestled like lion cubs. And so, day after day, Amina lived as a ghost in her own home, unseen, unheard, and unwanted. Still she endured. Every insult sharpened her will. Every act of cruelty toward her mother etched deeper lines of loyalty in her soul. She became a careful observer, learning to avoid Abina's gaze, to finish her chores before being shouted at, to smile without showing her sorrow. She learned to hold back tears like a dam, to draw comfort from small things: a bird's song, a whisper of breeze, the warmth of her mother's hand. Yet even in her silence, a storm was gathering. Amina knew, perhaps in the marrow of her bones, that this life was not her destiny. She was not born to be trampled under the feet of the loud and cruel. There was music in her blood, there was light in her mother's stories, and even in the dark shadows of the compound, a part of her still believed that someday someone would see her, really see her. And when that day came, she would not shrink or cower. She would rise, like the sound of her mother's drum breaking through the hush of night, powerful and unignorable. The rains came early that year, sharp and relentless, drumming against the roof like a restless spirit that would not be silenced. The wind carried with it a strange sorrow, as though the earth itself was trying to warn of a grief too heavy to bear. Amina sensed it before the rest. She could feel her mother's body growing frilier by the day, her voice softer, as if the fire that once lived in her chest had begun to flicker out. Amma no longer sang. She no longer danced, not even to lift her daughter's spirits. Her laughter, once soft and radiant like a lullaby, had disappeared entirely, replaced by a tired sigh that seemed to seep from her bones. Each morning she moved slower. Her steps grew uncertain. Her hands trembled even when pouring water or breaking yam. Amina tried to deny it, tried to believe it was just the change in season, the damp air making her mother's joints stiff. But in the quiet of night, when she laid beside her, she could hear the raspy wheeze in Amma's breathing, the way her chest rattled like a broken gourd. And then one night she did not wake. The house was still, The storm outside reduced to a soft patter, but inside Amina's world, thunder crashed louder than ever before. She shook her mother's shoulders gently at first, then harder, whispering her name, pleading, her voice breaking into whimpers. But Amma lay still, eyes closed, lips parted slightly, as if caught in the middle of a final prayer. Her body was warm, but her spirit was gone, vanished like mist when touched by sun. Amina did not cry at first. She could not. Her grief was too big, too raw, too sudden. She sat by her mother's side, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slowly, silently, as though movement alone could keep her from falling into a hole that had opened beneath her soul. Morning came, and with it, the bitter voices of the house. "She's dead," Amina said with a snort. Finally, one less mouth to feed. There was no funeral that honored Amma's quiet strength, no wails of mourning or songs of farewell. Kofi gave instructions for a quick burial behind the house, a shallow grave beside the cassava patch. No one lit a lantern or spilled libation. No one told stories of who she was. Amina was not allowed to dress her mother's body or even hold her hand one last time. Amina forbade it. "You'll bring death upon the house with your tears," she hissed. "Go sweep the yard. That's what your mother would want, work, not wailing." But Amina did wail alone. In the shadows, when no one watched, she howled into the night with the voice of every child who had ever lost the one person who loved them unconditionally. The drum her mother once played now sat silent, its skin gathering dust. Amina could not touch it. She could not bear the sound it would make because it would sound like goodbye. From that moment on, Amina became invisible, not just in the way she had been before, but in a deeper, more brutal way. With her mother gone, she had no protection, no warmth, no shield. She was tossed from chore to chore like a sack of grain, yelled at for breathing too loud, beaten for things she did not do, and mocked for crying when she thought no one was near. Her half-brothers sneered at her, and Amina made a sport of her suffering, inventing tasks to break her, denying her food, locking her outside in the rain like a stray dog. Kofi barely acknowledged her existence. Once, she saw him pass her in the compound. Their eyes met briefly. She searched his face for something, anything. Sorrow, guilt, memory. But there was nothing. His gaze slid off her like she was a ghost. And in that moment, Amina knew the cruelest truth. She had not only lost her mother, she had lost the only person in the world who had ever seen her as a daughter, as a child worth loving. The loneliness was like a second skin. It clung to her, seeped into her dreams, curled around her spine. She spoke less, smiled never. But inside, something had begun to grow. Slowly, stubbornly. It was not joy, nor was it hope. It was a kind of hunger, need. A longing to become something more than the girl who was left behind. She began to listen, to learn. Not from books or from lessons, but from the land, the wind, the rhythm of footsteps in the dark. She memorized the sky's moods, the sounds of different silences, the way pain could be swallowed until it turned to stone. And in the silence of her grief, Amina made a silent vow. Not with words, but with her very breath. "I will not remain in this place forever. I will become something. I will rise from the dust they buried my mother in." She had no map, no guide, no helping hand. But she had her mother's spirit in her veins, and that, she began to realize, was a light no storm could ever put out. It began with a whisper. Not a voice exactly, but something like the rustle of leaves that seemed to call her name. Amina, soft as breath, yet undeniable. It came on the edge of a sleepless night, when the moon was high and pale, casting silver threads across the compound walls. Her body was sore, her stomach empty, her spirit a flicker in the wind. And yet, something stirred inside her. Pull. Quiet urging. She followed it. Barefoot, she stepped beyond the fence of the only world she had known, into the thicket that separated the village from the woods. The path was faint, overgrown and thorned, but the air felt different here. Cooler, fuller, almost humming with a life too old to explain. Trees stood tall like guardians. Their limbs stretched upward as though they too were praying. Shadows danced, not with menace, but with purpose. Amina moved with caution but without fear. For some reason, This strange forest felt less cruel than the home she had left behind. She walked until the path disappeared completely, and still she pressed on, heart pounding in her chest like a forgotten drum. And then, as if the night itself parted for her, she saw her. The woman stood in a clearing surrounded by wildflowers that bloomed out of season. Her skin was the color of earth after rain, deep, warm, sacred. Her eyes glowed like amber coals, and her hair flowed long and silver, braided with feathers and pieces of bark. She was neither young nor old. It was beyond. As though she had stepped out of a dream Amina didn't know she'd had. "You came," the woman said, her voice a low hum that seemed to echo from the ground itself. Amina opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She didn't even know what to ask. She only knew that in this stranger's presence, the ache in her chest eased slightly, as though someone had finally noticed the weight she had been carrying. "You're not lost," the woman continued, stepping forward. "You were sent." Amina shook her head. "I don't understand." "You will." And with that, the woman reached into her robe and pulled out a small satchel, roughly sewn, smelling of crushed herbs and earth. She handed it to Amina without explanation. "This will keep your spirit from breaking," she said. "You are not like them. And that frightens them. But you must not forget who you are." Amina stared at the satchel, her fingers trembling as she accepted it. Something warm stirred inside it, a pulse, almost like a heartbeat. She looked back up, but the woman was already turning away, disappearing into the dark like mist through fingers. The journey home felt different. The forest no longer felt wild. It felt watchful, as if it had recognized her. Amina walked with a strange calm in her bones, the satchel pressed close to her chest. When she returned to the compound, no one had noticed she was gone. The world picked up as if she had never left. The shouting, the chores, the slaps across her back. But something inside her had shifted. In the days that followed, Amina began to change. She started dreaming. Vivid dreams filled with symbols, fireflies, rivers that whispered names, songs no one taught her but that she somehow remembered. She learned to move quietly, not out of fear, but with intention. She knew when to speak and when to be still. When animals looked at her, they did not flinch. When the wind blew, it curled around her like a friend. And though Amina's cruelty remained, and Kofi's indifference hardened, Amina's heart no longer shattered with every blow. One evening, when she was sent to fetch water from the far well, she paused by a tree where the cicadas sang low and steady. She opened the satchel. Inside were dried leaves, a carved stone shaped like an eye, and a single strand of silver hair. As her fingers brushed against them, her mind filled with a vision. Her mother standing by the sea, her arms raised to the sky, her laughter blending with thunder. The woman in the forest had not given her protection. She had given her memory, ancestral strength, path back to herself. And from that day forward, Amina was no longer merely surviving. She was gathering the fragments of a power she had inherited through pain, through silence, through the bloodline of women who had refused to be broken. She no longer waited for kindness. She was becoming the storm her mother once danced with. And deep in the forest, under a moon too ancient to name, the woman watched from the shadows and smiled. The village was awash with color. Banners of red and gold fluttered in the breeze, drums echoed through the air like the heartbeat of the land itself, and the scent of roasted yams and spice-slicked meats drifted like a promise through every path and compound. It was time for the Festival of Fire, the grandest celebration of the year, when the village honored the spirits of ancestors, and when songs, dance, and fierce competition revealed who among the youth had strength, grace, and the blessing of the gods. Amina had watched it from the shadows every year. She had scrubbed floors while others were adorned in beads and silks. She had fetched water for feasts she wasn't allowed to taste, and swept up the dust left behind by the footprints of girls who were praised, noticed, celebrated. But not this year. This year, something had shifted inside her. Something that no longer cowered, no longer waited for permission. She had grown stronger in silence. Her body, though slim, moved with startling precision, born from countless days of carrying heavy loads, escaping punishment, hiding in trees to steal moments of peace. Her spirit, once curled like a fist against her ribs, had begun to open. There was fire in her now, slow burning but unquenchable. When Abina announced that their daughter Kojo would be representing their household in the dance competition, Amina felt the familiar pang of exclusion. But that night, as she lay on the hard mat under the open sky, the wind spoke again, soft, insistent, full of memory. She rose quietly, walked barefoot to the drum her mother had once loved, and touched its skin. It sang beneath her fingers, low and trembling like a voice remembered. She closed her eyes and danced, not the way the village girls danced with rehearsed steps and practiced grace, but in a way that belonged only to her. Wild, raw, full of grief and fury and beauty. The earth moved with her. The trees leaned closer. The next morning, without asking, she added her name to the list of competitors. The elders laughed. Bina scoffed. "You think dirt can dance with flame," she mocked. But Amina said nothing. She simply waited. When the day came, the village gathered in the great circle. Crowds pushed in, eager to see who would impress the spirits and earn the year's blessing. One by one, girls in bright wrappers took the stage, their feet light, their arms fluid, their faces painted with confidence. Applause followed each performance. And then it was Amina's turn. She wore no jewels, no silks. Her dress was plain, faded at the hem. But her eyes burned like coals long buried. She stepped into the circle as the drums began, and for a moment the crowd hushed, not out of respect but confusion. Who was this nobody child, this servant girl with no name? And then she moved. It began with a single footstep, slow, grounded. Then another and another, until her entire body became a wave of memory and fire. Her arms sliced the air like wind through trees. Her feet struck the ground like thunder. She spun, leapt, collapsed to her knees, then rose again, every motion echoing something older than the village itself. She danced the sorrow of a mother buried without honor. She danced the cruelty of stolen childhoods. She danced the quiet strength of every girl who had learned to live unseen. But more than anything, she danced her becoming. And the crowd was silent, not in mockery, not in pity, but in awe. When the final drumbeat struck, Amina froze mid-motion, chest heaving, eyes wide, arms lifted toward the sky. For a breathless moment, time stood still. Then came the roar. People rose to their feet. Some clapped, others wept. Even the elders leaned forward, eyes shining with something like reverence. Abina's face was twisted in disbelief. Kofi looked as though the sun had risen from the earth itself. But none of it mattered to Amina. Not the applause. Not the recognition. What mattered was that she had stepped into the light and burned with her own fire. When the judges announced her as the victor, the words barely registered. She had already won. Not a prize, not a title, but herself. Later that night, as the sky bled into dusk and lanterns floated like stars across the river, a small girl approached her, barefoot, quiet like she had once been. She looked up at Amina and whispered, "Will you teach me?" And Amina smiled, not because she had become someone new, but because she had finally remembered who she had always been. The wind changed the day the letter arrived. It came wrapped in worn cloth, sealed with a strange wax emblem, a spiral surrounded by feathers and fire. The messenger, an old man with a bowed back and eyes like storm clouds, handed it to Amina without a word, only a look that lingered a little too long on her face, as though seeing a ghost or a promise fulfilled. She unwrapped it slowly, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of something long awaited. Inside were the words that cracked the past wide open. Her mother had not died from sickness. She had been silenced. The letter, written in trembling script, came from a woman named Mariah, a friend, a sister in spirit to her mother, who had escaped the village all those years ago when the darkness closed in. It told the story Amina had never been allowed to hear, that her mother, Celine, was once a healer of great renown, a woman whose gift threatened the power of the elders. That she had refused to submit, refused to let the old ways twist into control and fear. that she had been accused of sorcery and banished in shame, her name erased, her truth buried beneath layers of lies. They let her die in exile, a fate wrapped in silence and shadow. But before she fell, she had sent her daughter back into the village, not to be hidden, but to survive, to awaken, to remember. Amina clutched the letter to her chest and wept, not the hollow tears of loneliness, but the deep, trembling sobs of someone who has just seen the outline of their soul. Every question, every ache, every whisper in the night now made sense. Her mother had never abandoned her. She had protected her in the only way she could. The truth lit something sacred in her. That night, Amina returned to the forest, the satchel still close, the carved eye stone warm against her heart. The woman was waiting, just as she always had been, not in body but in presence. In the rustle of leaves, the hush of the trees, the sudden hush that fell when Amina stepped into the clearing. "You are ready," the wind seemed to say. Amina closed her eyes and let the energy rise. The dance of the festival had only been the beginning. Now her power bloomed, slowly then all at once. She felt the memories of generations surge through her veins. The laughter of her mother, the songs of her ancestors, the footsteps of women who had once stood tall and been brought low. She was all of them and more. The next day, she walked into the village square not as a servant, not even as a victor of the dance, but as someone who carried the weight of truth. And truth, when spoken, is impossible to ignore. She stood before the elders, her voice steady. She read the letter aloud, told them of the lies, of the injustice done to her mother. For a moment the village stood still, caught between denial and awakening. Then Mariah stepped forward, from the crowd, from the past, from exile. Her face lined with years, but her eyes fierce with memory. She confirmed every word. Others began to murmur. Some nodded, some wept. The air shifted. The lies, once firm as stone, began to crack. Amina tried to speak, to twist the moment into shame, but the people no longer listened to her. They looked to Amina now, not as a child, but as something more, a torch lit in the heart of darkness. Kofi stood in silence, shame etched into every line of his face, too late to take back the years he had wasted in ignorance. Change does not come in a roar. It begins in a whisper. But once heard, it cannot be silenced. They offered her a place among them, as a teacher, a leader, a bridge between past and future. But Amina, though grateful, had already chosen her path. She would not stay where her mother had been buried in shame. She would return to the forest, to the lands beyond, to spread what had been lost and to guide those who walked in silence like she once had. She left not in exile but in light. The same little girl who had once asked, "Will you teach me?" now walked beside her, and others followed. Young ones, quiet ones, gifted ones who felt different and wrong, now seeing in Amina the proof that their difference was divine. And as she walked into the sun-drenched woods, Amina smiled. She carried her mother's name like a crown, her pain like armor, her future like an open sky. She had not been broken. She had been reborn. And the wind, ever faithful, whispered around her. "You came home."